Hey everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Cognition Ignition. So, I've been doing a lot of thinking about type, and I've seemed to have a block on talking about it. And I think the reason is because looking at all the typology systems, I started to realize that there was a lot of dogma within them. And I started to realize that there is a lot of better ways to look at type than how I've been looking at it traditionally. And what I wanted to do was share some of my ideas in this episode and how I would like to demonstrate how some of my ideas came about is by sharing some examples when doing this. I think the problem is that a lot of how type is used is actually going against how Jung would have seen it. I think it's basically being used to say this is what somebody is and this is what they are throughout the lifetime. Well, when we think about what Jung did throughout his life, we can see that he worked underneath Freud for quite a while when he was in academia. And Freud had this idea that basically in childhood, children through interaction with their family and the other parts of their environment would develop a personality. Freud used the Oedipal and Electra complex, basically saying that how a girl would develop would be based on how her father was with her, and how a boy would develop was based on how his interactions with his mother were, and that would basically predict what would happen throughout the lifetime. And Jung disagreed with this. So he went out and decided he was going to come up with his own theory of type. And I think what Freud was doing is similar to what a lot of people try to do with type, where I think Jung accepted that Freud wasn't fully wrong. Our environment in young childhood, in our early childhood, our environment in early childhood would impact our development. And what Jung did was he actually put forth this idea that there was an archetypal development throughout life, throughout the arc of life. As you progress through life, things would change. And what he decided to come up with was the cognitive functions. But he had 40 volumes that he wrote, and he just continued adding to this. And when it came to the cognitive functions, I think he was very realistic, though he used a lot of mythology to explain it. I think he realized that when what he's even explained really is that everybody has undifferentiated functions when they are born. These functions are sensing, thinking, feeling, and intuiting, right? And that through development in early childhood, basically children were all using the sensing function. They are placed into an environment. They are interacting with it, extroverted sensation, and learning about it, introverted sensation. Extroverted sensation and introverted sensation can also be seen as a state of muscle memory, like learning something and then retaining that and using it later on. And I think he just saw it as this is what people were doing, all people were doing, and that every person was in a different environment. And if we look at Brofenbrenner's ecological systems, we can kind of see that at this point in life, people are basically in the microsystem. And they probably continue using this sensing function, undifferentiated, through a lot of their early development, probably up until 5 or so, and then they're going to have undifferentiated judging functions as well. So they're going to have undifferentiated judging functions that emerge from the undifferentiated sensing functions, and then you would start developing based on your interactions. And Jung did identify that there was a self, so there is this subjective interpretation of the environment, right? You're the zeitgeist that you're living in. And there is also the fact that the environment can control how you act. So, for example, with this, I have a son, and I'm just going with the idea that my son is under 5 years old, so he is using the sensing function. For me personally, wrestling is my favorite sport, and if I had everything my way, I would teach my son to wrestle, and then he would excel in wrestling, and that would really look like introverted sensing. He's taking on what I'm giving him. He would learn from memory. And I did put him into wrestling. I didn't push him into it too hard. I just said, I want you to learn how to move your body and things. And then a couple of weeks later, he said, Dad, I want to do baseball and football. Football, I was okay with. I don't really like baseball. But because I know type, I was able to look at this. I said, okay, I've been putting my own judgments onto him. And that's what he's been perceiving, and he's been going along with it, developing this SI. But now he's kind of seen the world through his own eyes, and he had this own introverted feeling. Dad, this is what I want to do. So I was basically, at that point, we couldn't sign up for baseball because it's not baseball season. But I said, okay, we're going to finish out this season of wrestling. And in the spring, you can go play baseball. And then in the fall, you can go play football. So right there, I could have basically, which some parents do, is say, no, you're going to stick to our traditions. Or I could have said, or I could do what I am doing and saying, okay, that's what you want. I'm going to allow you to do that. You saw something you liked, you can go after it. And I think this is the truth about development. The zeitgeist plays just as much of a role in development, because if I allow him to do what he wants, then I think you actually initiate a different mode of engaging with the world in a way. He saw something that he enjoyed. And even so, when he goes and does this, he's still going to be using SE and SI when he learns how to swing a bat and when he learns how to catch something. And he will be able to build stories about this, that will be SI that he uses later on. So that's kind of how I'm looking at type right now. All children are basically sensors. And in the background, they're using intuition. It's a completely background process. And I think, say I had put him into wrestling and said, that's what you're doing forever, he would be doing it, and maybe it would be SITE because it works, SIFE because it maintains the harmony. Either one, he's doing it because I told him, or I could let him kind of be more authentic and do the things he wants. And the intuition is by letting him do his own, I'm allowing him to use his own introverted intuition. That is something for him. Where if I had put him into, if I had only put him into wrestling, then he would have, in the background, been thinking about the possibilities of the other things he could have done, right? He would have been like, oh, well, I don't like wrestling. I'd rather be doing this. And he would never really know. It would just be an intuitive idea of like, hey, there's something better. The same way right now he has the intuitive idea, that's what I want. I want baseball, right? So that's how those functions actually work. And then I think another thing that Jung talked about was the idea of initiation. And I think that when initiation occurs on your own, you're developing a different attitude towards the function itself. So that was really the first thing I wanted to go over. And I think that it's a good thing to allow your child to use their intuition. It really, really is. You should. But I think that a lot of people have this idea that some children are just born highly intuitive. I really don't think that's true at all. I think it's actually dangerous to start thinking about it that way. And I think that if you actually think about it, you understand what Jung was talking about with the extreme archetypes that could emerge. And I do think that some people do try to push this type of development, but we can think about it like, so I'm saying my son is probably ESFP, ESTP. But I do think in his development, he's either going to develop through to an ENFJ or ENTJ, if I continue to allow him to use his own intuition and his own authenticity to make decisions. But I would not want to do that right now, where I think that some people think that, like, oh, if you want your if a child is an ENTJ, which I do see a lot of TENI in him, but it's definitely not like a strong thing at all. But I can see where if I allow him to continue doing things, he could do that. But I think some people try to, because they look at the system as like, if you're an intuitive, it means that there's really weak sensing and you don't use it. And it's like, no, that's not true. Your intuition strongly relies on sensing. Intuition in the strongest form means that what it really does is it controls the thoughts, the feelings, and the sensing. And I feel like if children don't get enough of the sensory experience where they're taking it all in and they're forming their own real interpretation of the world, even though it's going to be subjective based on their own, but they're forming a real interpretation of the world, then the intuition is never really strong. And I think that a lot of times because really when you think of what intuition is, Jung made it clear, like intuition was a powerful process that allowed things to continue to change and could make things improve. It was the transcendental function. And I think that, so like a lot of people either end up in SI or SE throughout most of their life, and then they're going to develop these introverted thinking, introverted feeling, extroverted thinking, extroverted feeling through that. And then eventually, through the intuitive process, because sensing, you can think of it as a container that continuously is filling up. And a child is that. They're continuously filling up. And then puberty comes along, and I think that's a natural intuitive process. Similar to like what a lot of religious institutions do with like communion and confirmations and things like that. I think our body has our own ways of forming intuition because intuition is embodied. The sensations are stored in your body and your neurons through neural networks. And then as your body begins changing, it moves. As it's moving, everything in your body, everything begins to start rearranging. You start building new networks through neurogenesis, and you start pruning. And that's really the unconscious process of intuition. And then from that process happening, you see a lot of teenagers say, oh, this is what I want to do. And they're really developing an ego there. When a teenager goes, oh, I want to learn this, or I want to do this. That's an ego function. It's developing an internal sense of thinking or feeling. And whether the child was influenced to act authentically or act according to rules is going to kind of influence this. I'm going to get into why I think Jung's an INTP based on this. But that's basically what's happening, this intuitive process where ego development is happening. You have basic SE where you know how to navigate the world. Your walking's okay. Hopefully you've learned some type of way to engage with the world, and now you're building your ego up to it. And I think successful development of this, especially with the SE types, I think they're going to be able to move towards intuition as they get older, especially because they're going to be following their own feelings or their own ideas or self-judgments about what they can do more easily. Where I think that SI users are going to have a point later in life where their intuition is used to start thinking about possibilities. Right? Extroverted intuition. They actually have to start thinking about like, how else would I want my life to be? I've lived it to other people's standards my whole life. How would I want this to be? And I think that's where you see a big split in development. And this is part of the arc of life. You have two different paths from early age. And then, somewhere around the 20s, 25 age, you see where they get to. And then they have to they're going to split again. I think some people are going to decide to stay in that sensing, introverted sensing, do their routine, especially if they have no way of getting into any, sometimes help like from outside, like a coach or someone you trust or care about can kind of help you influence the NE and help you move. And then you're going to do something and go back into your SI, but that SI is going to change because your FI led you somewhere, right? This is the archetype. And now you might still look like an ISTJ or ISFJ, but you're differentiated, right? But you have to get into that intuitive process at some point. And I would say if you have enough sensory experience, that's why I'm saying, you could talk to somebody that's a sensory experience, and they're going to tell you things, and then you're going to get a sense of who you are based on what they say. For the SETE, a lot of times, because it's contained, there is more of a natural trajectory to get to where they want. But even your SEFI, and even in brain scans, they show that ESFPs and ENTJs have very similar brain scans. So once that ESFP has a full contained sense of self, then they can start using their intuition in a more strong way to say, okay, I'm going to build a company based on this ESFP thing, right? And in between all of this, there are going to be other functions that emerge from the shadow even. Well, it's more that as you differentiate them, you choose one specific one you want to use, and then you realize, oh, I'm forgetting the other one. So if you're just using SE, you may want to actually begin, it's really the 6 function. So if you're using SEFI, so like if an ESFP wants to become an ENTJ, they're going to have to learn how to use FE. If an ISTJ wants to find a better path for their life for more stability, they may have to use TI. They might have to start parsing out the TE that they've been following along with forever and say, okay, like this works, this doesn't. This is what I want to take on. That's what all your functions will have you do. And this is just how I'm explaining it is just conceptual. I mean, the idea is that each individual will have their own way of doing this, based on what the sensing experience gave them, because every family you're born into is going to be different. And and then where you go to school is going to be different. So that's the big thing. And then I think these arcs go on, and that eventually you have this crystallized self before you die at some point. You have something that you created. The idea is to become a creator, right? So you had something that you created. And based on the types that you move through, what that thing that you create at the end is going to be different. It's going to be something that is universal. Like you see a lot of similar things in the universe. Because it's from the universal unconscious, but it's something that you grab from the universal unconscious and put your own identity into. And that's the point of type. And if we look at Carl Jung, we can really understand that, because I think Carl Jung was an INTP who developed his shadow functions, all of them. And I think what emerged was, it depends on how you look at it, but it was either extroverted thinking or introverted intuition, which is this system, and which most people would call like Carl Jung's tower. He built this over time. He built a tower in his mind that he basically wrote out in 40 volumes of books that he wrote. But the reason that I think INTP works a lot is because actually where Carl Jung grew up, like in the environment that he grew up in, his father was a pastor, and his family was religious, and his father was a scholar, and Jung took to both of those, but he didn't fully believe everything that his father believed about the religion. So I think that was like but he went along with it, and he followed suit on a lot of things his father did. So that was like his SIFE as a child, right? And then he went into academia. He worked with Freud. And I think from there, I think that was still SI. He was learning about how the systems work right now, right? And then he decided, oh, well, I don't fully agree with Freud. I think that there's more change that happens. So he went and he left academia. They kicked him out of the organizations that Freud basically ran for psychology for analytical psychology, and Jung went out and like studied mythology, and this was him getting into TINE. He was also using his intuition to take perspectives of a lot of different ideas and different ways that things happened, and then he basically brought everything together. But instead of using NI in the traditional way, that would be basically a command or some kind of insight. He used it to construct his tower. He would continue, every volume he added to this tower until the end of his life, where his wife died about, I think it was 6 years before him. When I think like towards the end of his life, he had created his own SIFE. Like this is how the world works. This is how you would maintain harmony. And it was this broad system that explained development. And the biggest thing to realize is that, yeah, you know, a type forms from early childhood. It's based on the zeitgeist, and that if we can influence people to get into their intuitive processes, they can begin to individuate. And that's the main thing that you need to know about type. We can go into specifics, but I really just wanted to start here with the broad approach that you should take to type. Understanding that it's not anything stagnant. It's why people are never going to have this exact type unless you did like a very in-depth longitudinal study on almost everybody. I mean, we have AI coming, so we don't know what's coming, but it shouldn't be that way. The idea is that like we shouldn't try to force a type of development. We should allow the intuitive process to continue moving. And just to black up everything I said, if you want to look up a term, the term Anti-andromia means that everything moves to its opposite. I always like to look at it as like everything flows from an area of high concentration to low concentration. Just think of water. Water is going to move to a dry area. And that is the entire purpose of this. So to clarify, Jung started off SIFE as in his midlife sometime a little bit earlier. He went to TINE, and he basically created a structure of the psyche from his inner world, TENI, and from what it seems like, he basically lived comfortably at the end of life. He had done what he wanted. He had experienced the things that he believed and where his intuition led him, and basically ended living a life where he had his wife and he was happy and he had SEFI. And I think that's not that we all have to follow his path, but that the idea that you aren't fixed at any point. If you can decide to initiate change and use all of your processes, that's the goal of life. And that's what I wanted to share. Thanks.